Maya mythology. Before the Maya became something you mostly associate with ancient ruins, mysterious calendars, and that one guy on TikTok predicting the end of the world every December, their mythology was already completely insane. We're talking gods, monsters, talking animals, death gods, supernatural trials, and an entire underworld called Xibalba, where apparently customer service was never invented. One of the greatest stories comes from the Popol Vuh, featuring the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque. Their father and uncle had previously been defeated by the Lords of Xibalba, so the twins eventually travel into the underworld themselves. Because apparently seeing your dad get murdered by supernatural death gods gives you the confidence to go fight those exact same guys. Xibalba is filled with deadly tests involving darkness, cold, jaguars, blades, and bats. But the twins don't simply overpower everything. They use intelligence, tricks, and deception to outsmart the rulers of the underworld.
You boys twins? Nah, we cousins.
Basically, they discovered that mythology has exploits. Their story involves death, sacrifice, transformation, and eventual resurrection, making them some of the most important heroes in Maya mythology. And modern media clearly noticed. Maya-inspired mythology appears in Smite, Onyx Equinox, and other games and fantasy works. Then there's Chaac, the rain deity, associated with thunder and storms. So when ancient Maya communities needed rain, they weren't opening a weather app. Please, Chaac, just one more week. And then there's Apuch, associated with death and the underworld. Every mythology eventually has one guy whose entire job description is just, you're dead. No promotion, no vacation, just eternal overtime. Arabian mythology. Now we're entering one of the biggest supernatural rabbit holes in the entire Middle East. And first, an important distinction, Islamic theology isn't the same thing as later Arabic and Middle Eastern folklore. But those traditions eventually became deeply connected through centuries of storytelling. Let's start with the jinn. In Islamic tradition, jinn are supernatural beings created from smokeless fire, possessing free will and intelligence. They're not simply evil monsters. Some can be good. Some can be evil. Some apparently just want to ruin your Tuesday. And that's what makes them creepy. A monster that attacks you is scary. A supernatural being that can think is worse. Then we have the ifrit, a powerful supernatural being that became especially famous through Arabic literature and later fantasy. And of course, modern entertainment turned the whole concept into Aladdin. Disney basically looked at supernatural entities and went, what if he's blue and hilarious? And somehow it worked. But Arabian folklore gets much darker with the ghoul, a supernatural creature traditionally associated with wilderness, graveyards, deserts, and consuming human flesh. These stories helped inspire the modern Western concept of the ghoul and continue to influence horror and fantasy. And then there's Iblis, whose defiance and role as a tempter became central to Islamic tradition. Bro was given one instruction and immediately started arguing with management. Across the Middle East, people also passed down stories of haunted places, encounters with jinn, cursed objects, and supernatural beings. Some stories were genuinely believed to have happened. Others were clearly folklore. But that's how these stories grow. One person says, I saw something weird. 30 years later, my grandfather fought a 12-foot demon. Where did the extra 8 feet come from? Folklore DLC. Persian mythology. Persian mythology has everything you could possibly want from an ancient mythology. Heroes, demons, magical birds, legendary kings, and one ruler who literally has 2 snakes growing from his shoulders. His name is Zahhak. According to the Shahnameh, Zahhak becomes a tyrannical ruler after being corrupted by an evil force, and the snakes growing from his shoulders eventually demand human brains. Imagine discovering 2 snakes have grown out of your body and thinking, honestly, becoming king should fix this. It did not. His tyranny eventually leads to rebellion, with Kaveh the blacksmith becoming a symbol of resistance. Kaveh is an ordinary craftsman who stands against Zahhak and uses his blacksmith's apron as a revolutionary banner. Bro went from repairing metal to overthrowing a dictator. That's a career progression. Then there's Rostam, probably the most famous hero of Persian epic tradition. This man fights warriors, monsters, demons, and supernatural creatures while riding his legendary horse, Raksh. One of his famous enemies is the White Demon, a terrifying supernatural being associated with the mountains. And then we get Simurgh, the gigantic magical bird associated with wisdom, healing, and supernatural power. If the Simurgh showed up in your fantasy RPG, you already know the developers would make you fight it 3 hours later. Persian mythology and epic literature have influenced countless modern works, while Prince of Persia famously draws from Persian history, culture, and imagery. Hollywood saw Persia and immediately decided, yeah, add time travel. But the real treasure is the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, containing centuries of legendary stories. And honestly, it's one of those books where every few pages you discover another character who makes your average fantasy protagonist look unemployed. Christian mythology. Now we're entering the mythology department that accidentally gave horror movies half their villains. Angels, demons, fallen angels, giants, apocalypse, and 4 guys riding horses who basically represent humanity getting absolutely cooked. Let's start with Michael the Archangel, traditionally portrayed as a heavenly warrior and defender against evil. And before you say it, no, not Michael Jackson. I know you thought about MJ, different Michael. Although Michael Jackson fighting demons would be an absolutely ridiculous movie. Then we have Lucifer, whose modern image as a fallen angel and ruler of hell developed through biblical interpretation, Christian theology, literature, and centuries of folklore. Modern entertainment has obviously gone crazy with this. Lucifer, Supernatural, Constantine, The Exorcist, Diablo, Darksiders. Humanity looked at the eternal battle between heaven and hell and apparently decided, make it playable. Then we get the Nephilim, mysterious figures mentioned in Genesis and later traditions, often associated with giants. And finally, Revelation gives us the full apocalypse package. Beasts, dragons, plagues, judgment, and the Four Horsemen. War, famine, death, and traditionally pestilence or conquest depending on interpretation. That's not an apocalypse. That's 4 different reasons to stay home. The Four Horsemen became especially famous in modern games like Darksiders, where they are turned into playable characters. Christian folklore also developed countless stories about demons, possessions, miracles, saints, visions, and encounters with supernatural beings. Some were treated as genuine events. Others became folklore. And that's why this mythology remains so powerful. You don't even need to invent the villain. The lore already came with one. Yoruba mythology. Yoruba mythology is one of those traditions where you hear 5 minutes of lore and immediately wonder why nobody told you about this sooner. At the center is Olodumare, the supreme creator, alongside a huge world of divine beings known as Orishas. And these aren't just random gods. They're connected with nature, human life, morality, destiny, war, rivers, storms, technology, and basically every department of existence. One of the biggest personalities is Shango, associated with thunder, lightning, kingship, and power. So yes, another thunder god. Zeus has competition. Then there's Ogun. I know what you think, you mother. Associated with iron, metalworking, hunting, warfare, and technology. His resume is ridiculous. Blacksmith, warrior, hunter, technology department. Bro has 4 jobs and still makes it look effortless. Then there's Eshu, a trickster and messenger associated with crossroads, communication, and choices. He's the kind of figure who doesn't necessarily destroy your life himself. He just gives you the opportunity to destroy it. Let's see what happens. Those are the 4 most dangerous words in mythology. Other important figures include Yamaya, strongly associated with the sea and motherhood in later traditions, and Oshun, associated with rivers, love, beauty, fertility, and prosperity. And these traditions didn't stay in West Africa. Through the African diaspora, Yoruba religious traditions influenced Santeria, Candomblé, and other religions across the Americas. So the mythology traveled across an ocean, survived enormous historical changes, mixed with other traditions, and is still culturally significant today. Modern media is increasingly drawing from African mythology too, including comics, games, and films. Marvel basically realized, wait, Africa has gods too? We've been waiting. Turkic mythology. Ancient Turkic mythology is basically what happens when you combine an enormous sky, an underworld, magical wolves, legendary mountains, and enough horses to make every fantasy movie jealous. At the center is Tengri, the great sky deity associated with the eternal blue sky, cosmic order, and divine authority. Basically, other civilizations looked at the sky and saw weather. The Turkic world looked up and said, "That's the boss." Then there's Erlik, associated with the underworld, death, and darkness. Tengri gets the heavens, Erlik gets the basement. Every mythology has a basement manager. One of the most famous legends involves the Grey Wolf, or Bozkurt. In a traditional origin story, an injured boy survives the destruction of his people and is raised by a she-wolf. Their descendants become connected with the legendary Ashina clan and the origins of the Göktürks. Human, wolf, empire. That's one aggressive family tree. Then there's Ergenekon, a legendary homeland where a trapped people eventually escape through a mountain by melting a path through it. Ancient Turks discovered Minecraft. Guys, we're trapped. Dig. No. Explosives? No. Fine, melt the mountain. And then there's Tepegöz, a terrifying one-eyed monster from the Book of Dede Korkut. Yes, another one-eyed monster. Ancient mythology really had beef with depth perception. Turkic mythology and steppe traditions have influenced modern fantasy, games, literature, and animation, especially through wolf symbolism, sky gods, warriors, and supernatural creatures. And the Grey Wolf alone has enough main character energy to carry an entire anime. Episode 1. I was raised by wolves. Episode 12. I founded an empire. No filler episodes. Colombian mythology. Before Colombia became famous for football, coffee, and people passionately arguing about food, its indigenous peoples already had an enormous collection of gods, spirits, sacred places, and creation stories. One of the most famous is the Muisca tradition, and obviously, we have to talk about El Dorado. The original story was connected to a real Muisca ritual involving a new ruler, gold dust, and offerings made at Lake Guatavita. Then, Europeans heard about it. Gold? And suddenly, common sense left the continent. The story gradually transformed into the legend of a golden ruler, then a golden kingdom, and eventually an entire imaginary civilization overflowing with treasure. One misunderstood ritual later, and Europe started a side quest that lasted centuries. El Dorado became a huge part of adventure fiction and inspired movies like The Road to El Dorado and games such as Uncharted. Then there's Bochica, a legendary cultural hero associated with the Muisca. He's connected with teaching people important skills and traditions and with a famous flood story. According to the legend, massive flooding devastates the land until Bochica intervenes and creates a path for the water to escape. Bro arrived after the entire civilization flooded and basically asked, "Who left the tap on?" Then we have Bachue, an important ancestral figure who emerges from a sacred lagoon with a child. She and her child become ancestors of the people, and eventually they return to the water and transform into serpents. So the creation story goes, here's humanity. Okay, we're snakes now. No notes. And Colombian mythology goes far beyond El Dorado, with many indigenous cultures having their own spirits, creator beings, sacred animals, and supernatural stories. Europe just saw the gold and stopped reading. Inca mythology. The Andes already look like someone designed them for a fantasy movie. Massive mountains, sacred valleys, cloud-covered peaks, ancient ruins. If I lived there, I'd probably assume the nearest mountain had a personality. And in Inca tradition, mountains and natural places could indeed hold enormous spiritual importance. One of the most important deities was Inti, associated with the sun. The sun was central to Inca religion, agriculture, political authority, and imperial identity. Then there's Viracocha, a major creator figure associated with the origins of the world and humanity. And Pachamama, associated with the earth, fertility, and agricultural life. So basically, sun, earth, creation, mountains, and humans trying not to ruin the whole thing. Classic. Some traditions describe Viracocha traveling through the world, creating or organizing humanity and civilization. Imagine creating humanity, then watching humanity immediately invent war. I should have stayed in the sky. The Incas also had elaborate beliefs surrounding ancestors, death, sacrifice, sacred locations, and the relationship between humans and nature. Then the Spanish conquest dramatically transformed the religious landscape, with indigenous traditions being suppressed, adapted, or blended with Christianity. But many traditions survived, and modern entertainment constantly returns to the Inca world. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example, uses ancient Mesoamerican and South American-inspired settings, while adventure fiction loves the whole combination of lost civilizations, sacred temples, ancient artifacts, and mysterious ruins. Hollywood sees an ancient temple and immediately assumes there's a boss fight underneath it. And honestly, they're usually right. Inuit mythology. Now we're going somewhere much colder. Much colder. Inuit traditions developed across some of the harshest environments on Earth, and their stories are deeply connected with the sea, animals, hunting, weather, survival, spirits, and the dangers of the Arctic. One of the most famous figures is Sedna, associated with the sea and marine animals. Her story exists in different versions across Inuit communities, but many versions involve betrayal, a traumatic transformation, and Sedna eventually becoming a powerful figure connected to the creatures humans depend upon. Imagine living in the Arctic. Your survival depends on the ocean, and the ocean is controlled by a supernatural being with a very complicated relationship with humanity. I'd be extremely respectful to seafood. Then there's the Tupilak, particularly famous in Greenlandic traditions. A Tupilak could be created through ritual as a supernatural creature intended to attack an enemy. But there's a catch. If the intended victim was stronger, the Tupilak could turn against its creator. So you created a supernatural assassin and forgot to check the stats. That's not a weapon, that's a workplace accident. And honestly, the Arctic environment itself already sounds like a horror game. Extreme cold, dark winters, thin ice, huge distances, predators. You don't even need a monster. The weather has already selected nightmare difficulty. Inuit-inspired creatures and Arctic folklore have appeared in horror, games, films, and fantasy, although it's important not to treat every fictional ice monster as authentic Inuit mythology. Sometimes a snow monster is just a snow monster. Not everything wearing fur has ancient lore. Amazigh mythology. And finally, we're ending with something that deserves much more attention: Amazigh mythology and folklore. And this one is different because there isn't one single Amazigh mythology. Amazigh peoples across North Africa have different languages, regions, histories, and traditions. A huge amount of this heritage was passed down orally, through families, villages, grandparents, storytellers. And that creates one huge problem. If nobody writes the story down, eventually the story can disappear. And imagine an ancient story surviving for hundreds of years because one grandmother remembered it. Don't go near that cave. Why? Something lives there. What? Just don't. And that's the entire encyclopedia. Amazigh and wider North African folklore contain stories involving supernatural beings, spirits, jinn, enchanted locations, curses, saints, magical creatures, and mysterious encounters. And because Amazigh traditions interacted with Arab, Islamic, Mediterranean, and other North African cultures over centuries, the result is incredibly layered, which makes it difficult to draw one giant line and say, this is exactly where everything started. Meanwhile, your grandmother already has a 40-minute explanation. No sources, no bibliography, just confidence. And that's actually what makes folklore so fascinating. It isn't a perfectly organized cinematic universe. Stories evolve. People forget details. People add details. Different regions develop different versions. And somehow, the story survives. Humanity has been making lore since the beginning. We just call it history when we're confident about it, and folklore when we're not. Which, honestly, explains a lot about the internet. And that's where we're ending this mythology rabbit hole. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me which underrated mythology I should cover next. And if you don't trust me, good. Check the sources in the description. I did the research. You do the FBI investigation. See you in the next one. Stay sane, if you can.
Everything lit when Zahhak drop. Turn up the heat, broke out the top. Came from the mud, now the gang get locked. I run the shit, better watch your spot. Haters talk loud, but they soft as fuck.